Hi everyone. So it's been about 3 years since I've uploaded a video to this channel, and I do intend to start producing some additional content. I know it's been a while. It's actually pretty amazing that there's only about 12 videos or so on this channel, and there's about 4,000 subscribers. So to me, that's quite remarkable. But in this video, it's more of a channel update. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and about how I tend to think about mental health issues, some of the different theories that I've been influenced by, just to give people a sense of where I'm coming from with some of the stuff. We'll talk about the channel, about my intentions, kind of setting it up to begin with, and my journey through making some of these videos and what the plan is going forward, or the kind of content that you might expect in the future. And then before wrapping up, I'll make mention of this other YouTube channel that I have. It's more of an academic channel where I have over 21 hours of video lectures from a fourth-year personality course that I taught this past year. Now, so just a little bit about me, I guess. So people who don't know, my name is Brad Peters. I am a clinical psychologist here in Nova Scotia, and I've been practicing for about 12 years. Now, I have a master's degree, so Nova Scotia is one of the provinces in Canada where you can practice with a master's degree and call yourself a psychologist, provided you have the requisite training and supervised experience. Now, to many other people who reside in other provinces or perhaps in the States, they might look to someone like myself and say, well, you're not a real psychologist, so why would I want to listen to anything that you have to say on these topics? And fair enough. I mean, if that's important to you, then by all means, you can unsubscribe to the channel or find your information elsewhere. So I'm not trying to in any way suggest that I have a doctoral degree or anything like that. If that's important to you, and I'm not going to get into a discussion about credentials and what is sufficient for clinical practice or anything like that. So that is that. So again, I have a master's degree. I am a psychologist in Nova Scotia. I've been practicing for about 12 years. Now, I made it into psychology, or one of the things that has steered me in this direction came through actually my interest in philosophy. And you'll get this sense, I think, through a lot of the videos. So some of my earlier interests were around, the nature of consciousness, like what is self-reflective consciousness? How do we come to understand that? I had been interested for a time in, the debates around, the mind and body, or what is the mind and how does it relate to a brain or a nervous system? Are they one and the same thing, or is there some complexity there that is worth attending to? I've been interested in, as I started to become interested in clinical psychology, I became kind of fascinated with the medical model of mental illness and the possible limitations of that model. I've been interested in the philosophy of psychology, which is, exploring the various concepts that we use in our theorizing, and the various suppositions and auxiliary hypotheses and assumptions that go into our theories. And our theories, of course, are what allows us to frame the data as meaningful and offers the subsequent lens through which we interpret something as evidence or not, in our empirical investigation. So a lot of these things they're more of a philosophical nature, and it's something that in the mainstream psychology tends to get glossed over, and these are areas that I'm very, very interested in. I've also been interested in some of the mainstream approaches to understanding, the kind of animal that we are. What is a human being, and what does it mean to have a personality, and so on. How it often devolves into various forms of reductionism. So I've been interested in possible biological reductionism and how we end up there, and more recently I would say it's become more fashionable to engage in a kind of social reductionism, and so I've been really interested in some of that as well. Frightened by both forms of reductionism as well, but And then, of course, the debates around free will and determinism and all that sort of thing. I think it's interesting, just as an aside, that many of our theories of psychology are they don't seem to make room for or kind of properly account for free will, free choice. That there's some volitional agency that would somehow, I guess, make room for personal responsibility and so on. And these are things that we tend to take for granted in our clinical work, but the theories in academia and in experimental psychology often leave that out, which is kind of interesting. Worrisome, I would say, as well. But so anyway, those are some of my theoretical interests. I'll delve into a lot more of that in this other channel that I'll reference in a little bit. But in terms of my clinical work and my clinical development, I started, as many people do, being exposed to cognitive behavioral therapy. So I'll try not to make a caricature of that approach, but it's basically the idea, the insight from this approach is that many times the psychological distress that we experience as human beings, the overwhelming emotions, and especially when we talk about depression and feelings of shame and social anxiety and so on, many of these dispositions that we find ourselves in can be kind of tracked back to the disparate modes of how we come to understand or interpret the world and ourselves and our relationships. So the idea is that, thought, how we conceptualize or frame just intuitively our understanding of ourselves and our relationships in the world will, in a way, kind of funnel us into predictable emotional dispositions, and that will either open up or close off different behavioral possibilities. So the idea is that if you can intervene at the level of thought in helping the client or the patient become more aware of certain patterns of thinking that often, kind of fly under the radar. We're often not aware of these different what are sometimes called cognitive distortions or fallacies. So a tendency to ruminate or to overgeneralize or to engage in a kind of mind reading where we imagine that we are far more capable than we actually are in being able to infer the thoughts or the motives of other people. So if we can get clear, so the idea is that if we can get clear on our modes of thinking and predictable kinds of distortions and fallacies and so on, if we can get clear on that and rationalize our thoughts, then it would alleviate a lot of our distressing feelings. So a lot of the cognitive work involves, homework, where a person, part of the homework would to track their thoughts, to write their thoughts down, and to be able to pinpoint certain places where assumptions kind of take over, and to challenge some of that, and then to report back to the therapist and work through some of that. So, of course, there's been a lot of research to suggest that this approach is an evidence-based approach, that it tends to help a lot of people. So I started with some of that very early on. But then at a certain point, I think I started to become aware of the limitations of those kinds of approaches. And then I became influenced by attachment theory. And attachment theory is a theory that emphasizes the importance of, it attends to emotion regulation, how we regulate our emotion, how we tolerate our feelings without becoming overwhelmed by them or having to psychically kind of disconnect or disengage from the experience of those feelings, and how our interpersonal relationships kind of play into that emotion regulation capacity. So, and how all this stuff kind of plays out, again, sort of intuitively in the background, pre-thematically, whatever you want to call it, we're often not aware that we engage in these patterns of relating to our own feelings or to other people. So that had a big influence on me. And at the time, I was doing a lot of work with children and children in the foster care system who have a lot of issues with emotion regulation and trust and that sort of thing. And so these theories sort of got me interested in the adult version of this stuff, which is more or less psychodynamic theory, which shouldn't be confused with Freud's psychoanalytic theory that everyone knows has the emphasis on psychosexual stages and that sort of thing. I'm not so much interested in that. But the insights from the short-term dynamic approaches that were really insightful, I would say that the two most important ones were the recognition of this phenomenon that is characterized as defense mechanisms. So the fact that we, voluntarily, but without being aware of it, we sort of unconsciously engage in subtle forms of avoidance or distraction or a kind of hyper-intellectualization, again, to disengage from various feelings that could be threatening to our homeostasis, our ability to just function and cope in the world and so on. And so that was one of these really profound insights. And I'm not aware of, please, if someone is aware of this, you let me know. I'm not aware of anything in the cognitive literature, even in the third wave CBT literature. I'm not aware of anything where they have a comparable term or acknowledgement of this phenomenon of defense mechanisms. So that was a really important insight. And also the second one that kind of ties into this is the role of anxiety. So anxiety, to someone working from a psychodynamic perspective, anxiety is often interpreted as being signal anxiety. So it's not just this fight or flight response that seems to come out of nowhere. It's something that's been behaviorally sensitized and becomes entrenched, or that it's just the result of dysfunctional thinking or something like that. It's actually the body intuiting that there's something threatening. And the difference between fear and anxiety is that in the case of fear, you know what the threat is. It's objective. It's something that you can reckon with, contend with, avoid, whatever, in the physical world. Anxiety is different because the threat is ambiguous. We don't know where it's coming from. And to the psychodynamic theorists, the threat is actually coming from within. It's the threat of becoming dysregulated by engaging with these feelings that are hard to sit with or tolerate or attend to in any sustained way. So the goal of psychodynamic therapy is not to settle the anxiety so much as to kind of regulate it and push into the anxiety to access the closed off emotional parts of that individual's self, right? And to then kind of open them up and to open up various possibilities, interpersonal possibilities, and so on. So that's an important part of how I come to understand the human being. Now, more recently, I would say in the last 3 years or so, and that's one of the reasons why I have been away from doing the video stuff, is that I get caught up in a certain literature or in reading, studying, and it kind of consumes me for a time. That's certainly part of it. But more recently, I have kind of cycled back to something that had been an early interest of mine, which is existentialism. So I'd always considered myself something of an existentialist. And more recently, I've delved quite deeply back into that literature, which has been really amazing and insightful. So I've been reading a lot of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Heidegger, which has been really challenging. But the existential kind of phenomenological approach is it's hard to even describe really without getting too bogged down in the theory of it. But I'll just say very briefly, it's kind of about tuning into the what it's like of experience just how our clients, how my clients and how we find ourselves in the world, how we experience reality, how we experience our relationships, our emotions, how we experience even time. Now that may sound strange, but to anyone who's been like very, very seriously depressed, you know that you have a very different experience of time than you do when you're not depressed, or to people who aren't depressed. Like time drags, like it really drags when you're in a very serious, profound depression. And your experience of meaning and your receptivity to various emotions changes dramatically. So all of these things, I think from an existential phenomenological perspective, they kind of deepen, to my mind anyway, the understanding and ways of engaging with clients and their suffering, and trying to get a sense of where they are, and how they're stuck. So that's kind of a thumbnail sketch, and that's all that it is, right? If you're wanting to get into more of the technical stuff around all of that, again, there's these lecture videos where you can check some of that out. So I guess I'll say a few things now about the channel. So to anyone who's never sat down in front of a video camera and tried to speak about a topic with any nuance or subtlety and at length and with some depth, it's incredibly difficult, like really difficult. So one of the first things that maybe you wouldn't necessarily think about, but when you engage in a conversation with another human being, you have all this feedback, all this kind of nonverbal feedback that you're able to kind of tune into and draw from. And so when you're speaking, you can see through the other person's eye contact and facial expressions, like whether they're with you, whether they seem to understand, whether they're confused, whether they're bored, whether they're irritated with you, whether they have signs of concern around the clarity of what you're saying. So all these things in a regular conversation allow a person to adjust themselves like on the fly in real time, and that helps tremendously. And you don't realize how important that is until you sit down and you're in a room and you're talking by yourself, not at a human face, but into this dark void or this lens. It becomes very awkward. Certainly at first, it takes a lot of practice. And then there's the weird, sort of phenomenon of the video itself. Like once it's done, it's done, and there it is on YouTube, and it's permanent, more or less, And so the spoken word, which is usually something that's fluid and alive, and it sort of has this sort of rising and falling and dissolves or something. Yeah, that's no longer the case, and now it's right there, and people can take snippets of it and take things out of context, or treat your spoken word as if it was the written word, and the same level of thought and care and nuances, and expecting that to be there, and it's really tough. It's hard. So that creates a lot of concern there. It did create a lot of concern. I think I'm past most of that now. And so I've toyed around with some different approaches. Initially, I started by, just sitting down in front of a camera and having a topic in mind that I wanted to speak to, and then okay, go, and then seeing how that plays out. And what I've learned is that it's just really time consuming, because at first it was, because you would speak to something and then realize that you made a bit of a mistake, or you kind of glossed over something important, and then you'd have to kind of reshoot it, and it would just take a long time. And then more recently, I was toying around with working from an actual script, which is what many of these professional YouTubers end up doing, right? So they're reading from this script. Now that's extremely time consuming as well, not only because, you save the time in doing the reshoots and all that sort of thing, but then you're having to practice reading from this script and practicing the timing of the delivery and, the proper intonations, in keeping with how it would actually be said more fluidly, and the proper emotional tone and all that kind of stuff. There's something about that just feels kind of forced or fake, or, it's kind of tiresome. But so, I'm not sure, I guess, what to make of that, but I think I've decided that I may do the odd script here or there, but I think more or less what I'm going to do is, going forward, is have a few of those bullet points, and speak to some of the issues. And if I gloss over something, or I make a subtle little mistake or error, I'm just going to trust that most of you will forgive me, and or point it out in the comments or whatever, and it'll be fine. Some of you who have been following the channel, you may have some questions about the comments themselves. So you may notice that if you make a comment, they are right now, as it stands, withheld until they're approved. And you may be wondering about that. Now, my intent is not to do that because I like censoring people or anything like that. It's the issue is actually that I for some reason I stopped getting notifications from YouTube or Google. And so what this means is that if someone puts a comment up there, I wouldn't know that it was there for weeks or months or perhaps never. And for most things that doesn't matter all that much. I mean, most people are offering really great comments and insightful comments, and supportive ones, which is really great, and critical ones, which is good too. But the odd time there might be something that kind of goes up there that I'm really concerned about, especially if the people who are following the channel and looking at the comments and whatnot, if they're dealing with some mental health issues. So the extreme example of that, I guess, is the two videos that I did on suicide. There was a couple of people who wanted to post these comments, and they're very lengthy, like a page long, like basically, from their perspective anyway, suggesting why suicide makes sense, or more or less advocating suicide. And I didn't think it was the responsible thing to leave that up there. I mean, I'm quite tolerant of a lot of stuff being up there, but it just didn't seem right to me, at least without a response. And the time it would take to respond to something like that is it's just more than I could deal with at the time. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do with the comments, and I'm not sure if I'm going to keep them as they are, needing to be approved, or if eventually I'm going to open them up. I'll have to think about it. If anyone has any thoughts about that, let me know. I'm curious to hear. Or if you, I've done an internet search on why this could be, why I'm not receiving those notifications. But if you think you know what it is, please let me know. I'd be really interested to figure that out. So another thing I want to comment on is the target audience. So who do I imagine myself to be speaking with, or who is on the receiving end of the video here? Well, I guess I imagine myself talking with people who have been struggling with some mental health issues. Perhaps they've gone to therapists in the past. They've been through the mental health system, perhaps, or people who have tried on their own to resolve some of the mental health issues that they struggle with, and are maybe looking for something a bit different from what they might get in some of the mainstream approaches. So that's in part who I imagine myself speaking with. So going forward, I have a lot of different topics I'd like to get into. So some examples of that include, again, discussing the importance of emotion regulation, what that involves, and how that might play into how we communicate in our emotional relationships. So one of the videos that I'm really interested to put up there and get some feedback on is looking at the flow in emotional communication, whether it be in a romantic relationship or with family members, friends, and so on, and noticing like places where that communication breaks down. So I've observed in the 12 years I've been doing this that there are predictable places where the communication will break down, and I want to highlight some of this so that you can maybe benefit from it and notice like yourself like where some of these conversations break down. I'm interested in maybe kind of sharing some thoughts in about how people often get stuck in therapy, or when people get stuck in therapy, like why that tends to be based on my experience. I might be interested to talk about different types of anxiety. So the difference, for example, between sympathetic nervous system anxiety and parasympathetic anxiety, and how that might be different from more of a panic type response, and how that might be different from existential angst or existential anxiety, and what all of that might say about the way that you are, or how you are, and how you're situated within the world. So I'm interested in kind of delving into these kinds of topics. So make sure that you subscribe if you're interested, and click the notification bell there before you forget. Now, before I wrap up the video here, I'll just make mention of this other channel that I have. So again, this is more of an academic channel. It has 21 plus hours of video content from this 4th year personality course that I taught at St. Mary's University. If you're curious about how I think about the human being and the relationship perhaps to society to a certain degree, that would be the place to maybe go. And again, what I'll do is maybe pick little snippets that are more clinically relevant, and I may upload them here on this channel as well. Now, on that academic channel, I also intend at some point to also use it as a place to offer a little bit of social commentary as it's relevant. Again, that may be a little bit far down the road. I'm also toying with the idea of doing kind of like a bit of a lecture, but on Camus' book, The Rebel, and so I might kind of go chapter by chapter through that book. I feel like that book is incredibly relevant at the present time in society, and so I might get into that. So if you're curious about that, then make sure that you check out that channel and subscribe there as well. So we'll wrap up there, and I really do, all the people that have subscribed to this channel, despite there not being a whole lot of video content. I promise I'll work harder at putting up some additional content. And yeah, we'll see you in the next video. Thanks.